The cabin lights glowed softly as the engines carried strangers across the ocean. Yet inside that plane, a single moment unraveled the distance between wealth and struggle. A man known for power faced a breaking point he could not buy his way out of, while a young passenger many chose not to see revealed a strength no one anticipated. What began as exhaustion and judgment grew into a turning point that would shatter assumptions and reshape two lives forever. Watch closely, because the truth behind this flight hides a twist that lingers far beyond landing. Don't forget to like this story, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what you think and where you're watching from. Jonathan Whitmore, a wealthy white businessman with a reputation for control and power, boarded a transatlantic flight carrying his 6-month-old daughter Emma, unaware that the journey would break down his carefully built image and set in motion a story far greater than his own. The cries began almost as soon as the plane left the runway, sharp and unrelenting, echoing through the polished walls of first class and drowning out the hum of the Boeing 787's engines. Jonathan, who had commanded boardrooms, acquired companies, and bent markets to his will, now looked like a man stripped of every advantage. Sweat clung to his temples, his Italian silk tie hung askew, and he bounced Emma in a clumsy rhythm that did nothing to quiet her. Toys clattered to the floor, bottles were pushed away, and every soothing word fell flat against her shrieks. Passengers shifted restlessly. A woman muttered complaints about parents who can't control their kids, and a man snapped his laptop shut with exaggerated force before burying his head under headphones. Even the flight attendant's professional mask faltered, her voice brittle with irritation as she asked whether anything else could be tried. Jonathan, exhausted and embarrassed, whispered that he had already tried everything, his confidence unraveling with every scream. What had seemed manageable when he left Catherine in Paris now revealed itself as a catastrophic miscalculation. Yet while chaos consumed first class, an economy set the story's true center. A black teenager named Malik Carter. Malik was 17 years old, tall and thin, his frame folded into the cramped seat of a last row beside the restroom. He wore a hoodie so worn it had begun to fray at the edges, jeans faded from years of wear, and sneakers scuffed from Chicago's sidewalks. Despite his appearance, his mind was sharp and disciplined, carrying with him the hopes of a family and a neighborhood that often went unseen by men like Jonathan. Malik was not just another passenger. He was a chess prodigy on his way to London for the International Youth Chess Championship, his one chance to secure a college scholarship that could alter the course of his life. His mother, Gloria, had worked endless double shifts as a nurse's aide to support him, scraping together entry fees, books, and travel costs. His father had been incarcerated when Malik was just 11, leaving him to grow up quickly and shoulder responsibilities far heavier than most boys his age. His little sister Zoe, now 7, had called him her hero as she helped pack his travel chess set and lucky pencil the night before. Malik should have been focused on memorizing openings and practicing mental exercises, but the piercing cries from the front of the plane kept cutting into his concentration. He tried to drown them out by staring at his miniature magnetic chessboard, but the sound carried past the curtain that separated first class from economy, loud and raw. He recognized the tone immediately. It was not just ordinary fussing. It was a cry of discomfort he had once known all too well. When Zoe was a baby, she suffered from colic, screaming for hours with stomach pains no pacifier could fix. His mother, exhausted from her shifts, had relied on Malik's instinctive ability to calm her. He would place his hand gently against her back, hum a low, steady rhythm from his chest, and somehow the tension in her tiny body would ease. His mother had called it his magic touch, a gift born of patience, empathy, and lived experience. Now, sitting cramped in the back of the plane, Malik felt that old instinct stir. The sound of Emma's crying gnawed at his conscience. He remembered his mother's words before he left. Greatness isn't only about what you do on the board, Malik. It's about what you do when nobody expects you to act. Those words echoed louder than the baby's wails. He thought about Zoe, how she had clung to him that morning before school, her voice trembling with pride when she said, "You're going to win in London, I just know it." And he thought about what it meant to carry his family's sacrifices on his shoulders. He could have stayed in his seat, convincing himself it wasn't his problem. After all, he had a championship ahead, and disturbing first class was a risk. But something inside him refused to let the moment pass. Malik's gaze drifted toward the heavy curtain separating him from the cries. Behind that fabric was wealth, privilege, and a man of power undone by a sound he couldn't control. Malik knew stepping forward would draw suspicious eyes, maybe even accusations. He was black, young, and out of place in the polished sanctuary of first class. He had faced those looks before, in stores where he was followed, in classrooms where teachers doubted his abilities, and at chess tournaments where opponents underestimated him until he checkmated them. But he also knew one undeniable truth: the baby didn't have to cry anymore. Malik was not just another teenager trying to pass time on a long flight. He was a competitor heading to the most important challenge of his life, the International Youth Chess Championship in London, where the stakes were far higher than just trophies or medals. Winning meant scholarships, financial stability, and a chance to carve a path no one in his family had ever walked. He had already envisioned the board, the strategies, the countless hours of practice drilled into him by his coach. Yet in this moment, none of those calculations mattered as much as the sound of a baby suffering. He knew that cry because he had lived through it with Zoe, his little sister, whose colic had tormented their family for months. He remembered the nights when his mother, exhausted from double shifts, collapsed on the couch, and Malik, only a boy, stepped in to carry his infant sister around their tiny apartment, humming low melodies until she finally slept. He had seen how the neighbors reacted, sometimes annoyed by the noise, sometimes offering small bits of advice, but always overlooking the quiet perseverance of a boy learning to be a caregiver long before his time. That was the foundation of the so-called magic touch his mother always praised, and it was the same instinct now pushing him toward first class. Malik's heart pounded as the flight attendant intercepted him near the curtain, her eyes narrowing in suspicion as she took in his worn hoodie, faded jeans, and dark complexion. Her words were crisp, firm, and meant to put him back in his place. "Sir, first class is restricted to ticketed passengers." Malik did not flinch. He met her gaze calmly. His voice, steady though his blood roared in his ears, and said, "That baby has been crying for hours. I think I can help." He saw it immediately, the flash of doubt in her eyes, followed by something colder, the reflexive prejudice that told her to see a threat rather than a solution. Malik had encountered this expression so many times before that it no longer surprised him. He had seen it in security guards shadowing him in stores, in teachers who acted shocked when he excelled in advanced placement courses, and in tournament officials who assumed he was only there to fill a quota until he toppled their favorite players on the board. He recognized that suspicion as surely as he recognized the sound of a baby in distress. Yet he held his ground, not aggressive, not pleading, but firm. His mother had always told him, the way you carry yourself matters more than the way people see you. And he lived by that wisdom now, keeping his shoulders square and his tone even. The attendant hesitated, clearly wrestling between rules and empathy. But before she could speak, the curtain was pulled back with force, and there stood Jonathan Whitmore. His face, once polished with control, was pale and drawn, his bespoke suit rumpled and stained with spit-up, his eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. He clutched baby Emma against his shoulder, her screams unrelenting, his composure utterly shattered. The man who had commanded corporations now looked like any other desperate father, and in that moment his pride cracked. "Please," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. "I'll pay anyone who can stop her from crying." The words hung in the air like a confession, a billionaire begging for help in front of strangers. Most passengers avoided his eyes, unwilling to acknowledge his vulnerability, but Malik stepped forward, his hands slightly raised as if approaching a frightened animal. "Sir," he said quietly, "I might be able to help your daughter." Jonathan's gaze snapped toward him, and for a fleeting instant something ugly flickered there. Suspicion born not just of a stranger, but of a young black teenager stepping out of economy into the sanctuary of first class. That flicker might have lasted longer had Emma not screamed again, her face red, her tiny fists balled in pain. Desperation overrode doubt, and Jonathan's arm sagged. "You have experience?" he asked, his voice strained, trying to mask the skepticism. Malik nodded once, his voice calm though his chest tightened. "My little sister had colic. I know what to do." He extended his arms, and the billionaire hesitated only a moment before surrendering his daughter into Malik's hands. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. As Malik cradled Emma against his chest, he felt her tiny body trembling, the tension in her muscles, the tightness in her belly, all familiar signs. He began moving instinctively, one hand supporting her head, the other applying gentle pressure to her back, rocking his body in a rhythm so subtle it seemed almost detached from the turbulence of the plane. He hummed softly, not a lullaby, but a deep vibration that resonated from his chest into hers. "She's probably got gas," he murmured, barely loud enough for Jonathan to hear. "Sometimes it's not about what they need, it's about how their body feels." Minutes passed, and slowly the impossible began to happen. Emma's cries softened into hiccuping sobs, then into whimpers, and finally her breathing steadied. Malik felt the familiar pressure of being judged, of being assessed not by his abilities, but by his skin, his clothes, and his place on the boarding pass. Jonathan Whitmore, standing beside him, seemed torn between disbelief and gratitude. His gaze fixed on Emma, now sleeping peacefully in the arms of a teenager who had moments earlier been just another anonymous passenger in economy. The billionaire's pride had taken a blow, and while his relief was genuine, old habits of skepticism lingered. He asked questions, his tone wavering between curiosity and incredulity. "How did you do that? Where did you learn something like this?" Malik answered simply, "My little sister had the same problem. I learned by helping her when no one else could." His calmness disguised the rush of adrenaline coursing through him. Jonathan studied him carefully, noting his steady posture, his confident hold on the baby, and the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from him despite his youth. Yet Malik also saw the flicker of hesitation, the subtle narrowing of Jonathan's eyes, the unspoken thought that a boy from the south side of Chicago, black and dressed in worn clothes, did not belong here, cradling the daughter of a billionaire in first class. Malik had seen this before in different forms. Teachers surprised at his intelligence, tournament referees second-guessing his wins, security guards trailing him in stores. It was the same prejudice repackaged, a reflex that judged him before he spoke. Even now, after he had done what no one else could, he sensed that he was being evaluated not only for his actions, but for his audacity in stepping into a world that wasn't meant for him. The other passengers reinforced this feeling. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her companion, whispering something behind her manicured hand, her eyes darting to Malik. A man further down cleared his throat pointedly, shifting as if still uncomfortable, unwilling to fully accept that the peace they now enjoyed had come from the intervention of someone they had likely dismissed on sight when boarding. Malik did not shrink from their scrutiny. He had grown used to walking into spaces where he was not welcome, from high school classrooms filled with doubt to chess halls where the odds were stacked against him. He knew that his presence alone challenged expectations, and he carried that burden with practiced composure. Emma stirred slightly in his arms, and Malik adjusted her carefully, pressing his palm against her back again, humming softly until she settled once more. The action reminded Jonathan of how helpless he had been moments earlier, and gratitude softened his expression. For a moment, father and teenager stood side by side, bound by the fragile calm of the baby. But the tension had not disappeared. The flight attendant, clearly uneasy about how quickly the situation had spun out of her control, stepped forward and addressed Jonathan rather than Malik. "Sir, would you like me to take the baby back now?" she asked, her voice pitched politely, but her eyes fixed on Malik with unease. Jonathan hesitated, glancing between his daughter and the boy who had calmed her, then shook his head. "No," he said firmly, surprising even himself. "She's comfortable right where she is." The attendant blinked, her practiced smile faltering, and stepped back, chastened. Malik caught the exchange and felt the subtle sting of being bypassed, spoken around rather than spoken to, treated as if he were invisible even while holding the focus of the entire cabin. Yet he also recognized the small victory in Jonathan's refusal, a sign that the man who had initially doubted him was beginning to acknowledge his worth. Still, Malik knew this was only the beginning. But prejudice did not vanish because of a single act of kindness. It lingered, clung, and reasserted itself in different ways. Jonathan Whitmore stood in the aisle of first class with his suit wrinkled, his tie hanging loose, and his arms trembling from hours of holding his inconsolable daughter. And in that moment, the billionaire looked nothing like the commanding figure who dominated boardrooms and financial headlines. His face was pale, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, and his voice cracked when he spoke. The entire cabin had watched him unravel piece by piece, and the image of his wealth and authority had shrunk until he was just another father lost in the storm of a child's endless cries. The passengers around him whispered or turned away, their earlier annoyance shifting into discomfort at witnessing his vulnerability. But Jonathan no longer cared about appearances. Desperation had stripped him bare, and when he finally spoke, it was not with the authority of a man used to commanding, but with the plea of someone ready to surrender. "Please," he said, his voice breaking, "I'll pay anyone who can stop her from crying." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. A billionaire offering money not for power or influence, but for silence and peace. No one moved. The first-class passengers, usually eager to please or impress a man of Jonathan's stature, avoided his eyes. Perhaps they were embarrassed for him. Perhaps they had no faith in their own ability. But they remained still, as if waiting for someone else to answer the call. And then, quietly but firmly, Malik Carter stepped forward from where he had been standing near the curtain. He had already earned suspicious glances and dismissive whispers, but he did not let that stop him. His voice was steady, carrying across the tense cabin. "Sir," Malik said, "I might be able to help your daughter." Jonathan turned his head toward the sound, and his eyes landed on the tall, lanky black teenager in the faded hoodie. For a moment, something sharp flickered across his face, doubt sharpened by prejudice. The instinctive question of whether this boy could possibly know anything about the delicate life in his arms. But Emma's screams pierced through the hesitation, and Jonathan's shoulders sagged. "You have experience?" he asked, his words tinged with skepticism, almost pleading for reassurance. Malik nodded. "My little sister had colic. I helped take care of her. I know what to do." He extended his arms slowly, not demanding but offering, his palms open and steady. The sight of him, a boy from the back of the plane with no expensive suit or polished shoes, standing in the center of first class and asking for trust, was almost surreal. Jonathan hesitated, his grip tightening around Emma, his protective instinct warring with his exhaustion. He studied Malik, the seriousness in his eyes, the calm confidence in his posture, and for a heartbeat he considered dismissing him, retreating into pride and doubt. But Emma wailed again, her tiny face crimson, her little fists flailing against his chest, and the sound tore through him until his pride broke. With a deep, shuddering breath, Jonathan lowered his daughter into Malik's waiting arms. The cabin seemed to freeze as the exchange took place, every passenger watching as if witnessing something far more significant than the passing of a child. Malik cradled Emma with practiced ease, one hand supporting her fragile head, the other resting gently against her back. She was trembling with the force of her cries, her body stiff with discomfort, and Malik moved instinctively, rocking her in a subtle rhythm, his long frame swaying almost imperceptibly with the motion of the plane. He began to hum, low and steady, a sound more felt than heard, a vibration that resonated through his chest and into hers. The cries faltered, softened into hiccups, and then dwindled into small whimpers. The transformation was astonishing. Emma's tiny body began to relax, her fists unclenching, her breathing evening out, her face losing the deep red flush. Within minutes, her eyelids drooped, heavy with exhaustion, and she drifted into an uneasy but peaceful sleep against Malik's chest. The silence that followed was profound. Passengers who had been fidgeting, sighing, and rolling their eyes now sat in stunned stillness, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. A woman who had earlier muttered complaints now pressed her lips together, ashamed of her impatience. The businessman who had slammed his laptop shut peeked over his headphones, eyes widening at the sight of the boy from economy, holding the baby with more skill than any of them had imagined. Jonathan stared as if unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He had consulted pediatricians, read parenting books, and paid for every convenience money could buy, and yet none of it had prepared him for this moment. A teenager he would have overlooked on any street corner had just accomplished what all his resources had failed to do. Gratitude surged through him, but it tangled with shame, because he knew that his first instinct had been doubt, born not from reason, but from prejudice. Malik kept his eyes on Emma, whispering softly, "There you go, little one. Just needed someone to understand." His tone was not boastful, not self-satisfied, but tender, as though the baby's comfort was the only thing that mattered. When he finally looked up, Jonathan's eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. Respect, fragile but real, began to form. Malik carefully transferred Emma back into her father's arms, showing him how to support her head, how to apply the gentle pressure on her back. "Sometimes it's not about what they need, it's about how their body feels," he explained quietly. Jonathan mimicked his movements, awkward but attentive, and for the first time since takeoff, Emma remained calm in his embrace. The billionaire's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He could only nod, humbled. The flight attendant who had tried to stop Malik earlier lingered nearby, her posture stiff, her cheeks flushed. She looked as if she wanted to apologize, but could not bring herself to do so. Instead, she busied herself with meaningless tasks, avoiding Malik's gaze. The other passengers shifted uneasily, caught between gratitude for the silence and discomfort at the realization that they had judged too quickly. Yet even as relief swept through him, the image of what had just happened gnawed at his pride. He had offered money, desperate for help, and none of the polished first-class passengers had risen, none of the attendants with their training manuals had succeeded, and yet a black teenager from the back of the plane had done what no one else could. Jonathan replayed the moment in his mind, the hesitation before handing over his daughter, the doubt he had felt because of Malik Carter's hoodie, his dark skin, his economy-class boarding pass. That hesitation burned him now, because the boy had not only calmed Emma, but had done it with such practiced ease it was clear this was not luck, not chance, but knowledge born of lived experience. Malik sat quietly in the seat beside him now, Emma's cries no longer a barrier between them, but a bridge. The boy did not gloat, did not smirk, did not even seem aware of the shift in power that had taken place. He simply leaned back, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze steady and calm. Jonathan studied him, seeing details he had overlooked before. The sharpness in his eyes, the long fingers that seemed made for delicate work, the way he held himself with quiet confidence despite the clear wear on his clothes. He wanted to ask questions, but he hesitated, uncertain how to begin, still weighed down by the shame of his earlier assumptions. Malik broke the silence first, his voice low but firm. "She's going to be fine now. Just keep her upright a little longer. Sometimes it's just pressure in the stomach. I used to do this all the time for my sister." Jonathan blinked, surprised by the matter-of-fact tone, surprised again by the way the boy spoke, not like someone trying to impress, but like someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "Your sister," Jonathan repeated, more to buy time than anything else. Malik nodded. "Zoe. She's 7 now, but when she was a baby, she cried like this almost every night. My mom worked nights, and my dad wasn't around, so it was me who had to figure it out. I guess I just learned what worked." Jonathan absorbed the words, each one painting a picture of a life he had never known, a world where a boy barely out of childhood became a caretaker because there was no one else. He thought of his own childhood, the tutors, the nannies, the safety nets that had cushioned every fall, and the contrast was staggering. He glanced down at Emma, asleep now, and wondered what kind of man she would grow up to be if her world ever demanded that much from her so young. The silence in the cabin deepened as passengers settled into their relief, some sneaking glances at the scene in disbelief, others pretending nothing had happened. The flight attendant who had tried to stop Malik earlier now brought Jonathan a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes avoiding Malik. Jonathan accepted the glass, but found himself irritated by her avoidance. He wanted to snap at her, to tell her that the boy she had dismissed had just done more for this flight than anyone else. But he held his tongue, uncertain why he felt the need to defend him so strongly. Malik, for his part, ignored her entirely. He had grown accustomed to being invisible to people like her, and he did not waste energy demanding recognition. Instead, he looked at Jonathan, his expression unreadable, and said, "You should try holding her the way I showed you. Firm but gentle. Babies can sense when you're nervous." Jonathan shifted Emma slightly, copying the motions Malik had demonstrated earlier, and was startled when she remained calm, her breathing steady. The pride that flickered across his face was not the pride of a billionaire, not the pride of a man who owned empires, but the simple pride of a father learning something new. Malik noticed but did not comment, though a faint smile touched his lips. It was enough for him to see Emma at peace. Jonathan felt compelled to say something, to bridge the gap between them, and finally he extended his free hand. "Jonathan Whitmore," he said, the name carrying the weight of his reputation, though it suddenly felt strangely hollow. Malik took the hand without hesitation. Malik Carter. The handshake was firm, equal, and in that moment Jonathan realized how rare it was for him to meet someone without the transaction of power hanging between them. This boy had nothing to gain from him, nothing to prove, and yet he had already given him more than most of his closest advisors ever had: peace, humility, and perspective. The cabin continued its quiet lull, but for Jonathan, the silence was no longer just about the absence of Emma's cries. It was about the space that had opened between him and Malik, a space where conversation might flow, where understanding might grow, where the barriers of race, class, and status had been momentarily set aside. He looked at the boy again, really looked this time, and saw not just a teenager in a hoodie, but someone carrying the weight of his family, his neighborhood, his future. He felt a stirring of curiosity, a desire to know more, to understand how someone so young had acquired such steadiness. Malik, sensing his gaze, tilted his head. "What?" Jonathan shook his head, almost embarrassed. "Nothing. Just thank you. You didn't have to step up, but you did." Malik shrugged. He cleared his throat softly, careful not to wake Emma, and said, "So Malik, you said you were going to London for something?" Malik turned his head, his eyes bright but cautious, and nodded. "The International Youth Chess Championship. I qualified earlier this year. If I do well, I can win a scholarship for college. It's my best chance." Jonathan studied him, surprise flickering across his face. He had expected perhaps a story about visiting relatives or a simple vacation, not a world-class competition. "Chess," Jonathan repeated, his voice thoughtful, as if rolling the word around in his mind. "That's impressive. I never had the patience for it myself." Malik shook his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "It's not about patience. It's about patterns, seeing moves before others can. You don't wait, you anticipate." The words hung in the air with quiet authority, and Jonathan found himself strangely drawn to them. Anticipation, seeing patterns, consequences rippling across a board. These were not foreign concepts to him, a man who built his empire on recognizing trends before anyone else. But hearing them from the mouth of a teenager made them feel new again. "That sounds a lot like business," Jonathan admitted, shifting Emma carefully so she remained asleep. Malik shrugged, his tone neither boastful nor dismissive. "Or life. Every move you make matters, even the ones people don't notice. The wrong move can ruin everything. The right move can change the whole game." Jonathan stared at him, taken aback by the clarity in his words, the depth that seemed beyond his years. He thought of the boy's life, of what he had mentioned earlier about his sister and his absent father, and he began to understand that Malik's wisdom had been forged not in comfort, but in necessity. "Your family must be proud," Jonathan said finally, perhaps more as a question than a statement. Malik's expression darkened for a moment before he replied, "My mom is. She works nights as a nurse's aide. She's the reason I've made it this far. My little sister looks up to me, too. My dad, he's not around. He's been in prison since I was 11. The words were spoken plainly, without self-pity, but Jonathan felt them hit like a weight. He had lived his entire life cushioned by privilege, shielded from hardship. And here was a boy who carried burdens that would crush most men twice his age, speaking of them with steady composure. Jonathan glanced down at Emma again, wondering how different her life would be, wondering what kind of resilience she would ever need to build when every door would always be open to her. The contrast gnawed at him, peeling away layers of his own certainty about the world. Malik shifted slightly in his seat, sensing the weight of Jonathan's silence, and added, "That's why this tournament matters. If I win, I can pay for school, maybe even help my mom and sister. If I lose," he trailed off, shrugging, but the meaning was clear. For Jonathan, losing a deal meant a temporary setback. For Malik, losing could mean an entire future slipping away. Jonathan felt a pang of guilt, not just for his earlier doubts, but for the realization of how little he understood about lives outside his own. He had dismissed Malik at first sight, measured him by the color of his skin and the clothes he wore, and now he was confronted with a young man whose intellect and determination outshone many of the people Jonathan surrounded himself with daily. He took a breath, then said, "I underestimated you. I shouldn't have, but I did, and I'm sorry for that." Malik looked at him steadily, not with anger, but with a calm acknowledgement of truth. "You're not the first," he replied, "and you probably won't be the last. But sometimes the only way people learn is by being proven wrong." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Jonathan nodded slowly, accepting them, and found himself strangely grateful for the honesty. Emma stirred in his arms, and he tried to mimic the techniques Malik had shown him, pressing gently against her back, rocking with subtle rhythm. To his relief, she settled again, and he looked at Malik with a small, almost sheepish smile. "Firm but gentle, right?" Malik returned the smile, his eyes softening. "Exactly. Babies can sense tension. If you're nervous, they feel it." Jonathan chuckled quietly, careful not to wake Emma. "That's not much different from running a company, now that I think about it. People can sense when you don't believe in yourself." Malik nodded. "Or when you underestimate them." The statement was pointed but not harsh, and Jonathan absorbed it like a man hearing a lesson he should have known all along. Their conversation continued, flowing more easily now, moving from chess strategies to business tactics, from Malik's training sessions with his coach to Jonathan's memories of building his company from a garage. The differences in their worlds remained vast, yet within their words they found surprising common ground. Both understood pressure, both understood sacrifice, both understood the importance of seeing what others missed. Jonathan realized that this boy from the south side of Chicago was teaching him more in one conversation than some of his most highly paid advisors had managed in years. He looked at Malik not as an intruder in first class, but as a partner in dialogue, someone whose perspective was valuable precisely because it came from a different world. He had built his empire by spotting potential before others, by investing in ideas and people who seemed overlooked. And here before him sat a young man who had stepped from the shadows of economy into the glaring light of first class and proved himself with nothing more than instinct, courage, and a steady pair of hands. Jonathan kept watching Malik, noticing the confidence in the way he spoke, the calmness in the way he carried himself, and the intelligence that shone whenever he explained his chess strategies. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt the same spark he had once felt in his garage as a young entrepreneur searching for partners who believed in the impossible. He glanced down at Emma, resting peacefully, then back at Malik, and in that moment the thought solidified. He wanted this boy not as an employee in the traditional sense, but as someone who could teach him lessons he had never learned, someone who could help him as much as he helped his daughter. Clearing his throat, Jonathan shifted Emma gently into the bassinet that a flight attendant had finally set up. He leaned toward Malik, lowering his voice so as not to wake her. "When does your tournament end?" he asked, his tone casual but edged with something more deliberate. Malik blinked, surprised by the sudden question, but answered honestly, "Sunday afternoon, if I make it to the finals." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully, his fingers drumming against the armrest in the rhythm of a man considering a deal. "And after that, you're heading back to Chicago." Malik hesitated, sensing something behind the question. "That's the plan. I need to get back to school, back to my mom and sister." Jonathan studied him, weighing the response, and then spoke with the decisiveness of a man who had never been afraid to make bold offers. What if you came to Paris instead, at least for a week? My wife Catherine and I will be there, and I could use your help with Emma. You've clearly got a gift, and I would pay you well, better than any job you could find back home. I promise you that. You'd have accommodations at our hotel, meals, everything covered. Call it a consultancy if you like." The words tumbled out, not rehearsed but raw, and for a moment Jonathan was not sure how Malik would respond. The boy's eyes widened slightly, his mouth parting as he processed what had just been offered. A billionaire asking him, a kid from the south side of Chicago, to work for his family in Paris. Malik felt the weight of it immediately, the swirl of temptation and disbelief colliding in his chest. He thought of his mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion to give him this chance at London. He thought of Zoe, who had hugged him tightly before he left, whispering that he was her hero. He thought of the tournament, the scholarship, the dream that had carried him this far. Could he really afford to detour? Could he even trust that this offer was genuine? Malik met Jonathan's gaze carefully, searching for signs of condescension or pity, but what he saw instead was sincerity, tinged with desperation. This was not just a wealthy man throwing money at a problem. This was a father who had been humbled, who had realized that expertise could come from unexpected places, and who now wanted to keep that wisdom close. Malik took a breath and said slowly, "I don't know, sir. I'd need to think about it, and I'd need to talk to my mom. I can't just make decisions like that without her." Jonathan nodded immediately, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a sleek business card embossed with his name and private number. "Of course. Take your time. Focus on your tournament first. But know this, the offer stands, regardless of whether you win or lose. You've already proven your value." Malik accepted the card, turning it over in his hand, the weight of the thick paper a physical reminder of the gulf between their worlds. He tucked it into his pocket, unsure whether it was a bridge or a burden. The flight attendants, who had been watching the exchange with thinly veiled curiosity, now hovered more deferentially, as if Jonathan's attention had conferred legitimacy upon Malik's presence. The same attendant who had earlier blocked him from entering first class now offered him a drink with a smile that seemed forced, her earlier suspicion replaced with a fragile attempt at respect. Malik declined politely, choosing instead to keep his focus on the conversation. Jonathan leaned back, his eyes still on Malik. "You're an unusual young man," he said softly. "Most people in your position would have stayed seated, ignored the crying, kept to themselves. But you didn't. You stepped up when no one else did. That tells me more about you than any resume ever could." Malik absorbed the words, conflicted. He had not stepped forward for recognition, nor for reward. He had acted because it felt right, because he could not sit idle while someone suffered. Yet here he was, sitting beside one of the wealthiest men in America, being offered an opportunity that could change the course of his life. He wondered whether accepting would betray his own values, or whether it was simply another move on the chessboard of his future. As the plane continued its steady journey, Malik's mind raced with questions. What would his mother think? Would she see this as a distraction or as a blessing? What about his coach, who had drilled him endlessly for this tournament, who had told him that focus was everything? Could he balance both worlds, the chessboard and the billionaire's baby? Or would one cost him the other? Jonathan seemed to sense the boy's inner turmoil, because he did not press further. Instead, he adjusted Emma's blanket in the bassinet, his movements awkward but earnest, and then looked back at Malik. "Whatever you decide," he said, his voice softer now, "I want you to know you've already made a difference. You didn't just help my daughter. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That value isn't measured by money or status. It's measured by what we do when it matters." The words struck Malik, resonating with his mother's advice, the same wisdom she had instilled in him since childhood. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I'll remember that," he said quietly. The two sat in silence after that, not the tense silence of suspicion, but the comfortable silence of shared understanding. He thought of his mother Gloria, bent over from exhaustion after another night shift, her smile tight but proud as she pressed taxi fare into his hand before he left. He thought of Zoe, her small arms wrapped around his waist as she whispered that he was her hero, the one who would make it out, the one who would prove to the world what their family was capable of. And he thought of the chessboard, the tournament in London, the scholarship that represented not just hope, but survival. All of that had been his focus when he boarded this flight, the single narrow path he had set for himself. But now that path had split into two. One road led to London, the chess championship, the chance to earn his future through victories on the board. The other road, unexpected and strange, led to Paris, to working for a billionaire's family, to financial compensation that could change everything for his mother and sister in ways a scholarship alone might not. It felt like standing before a chessboard mid-game, staring at a fork, knowing whichever move he chose would determine the entire flow of the match. Jonathan sat across from him, leaning forward slightly, his eyes flicking between his daughter Emma, sleeping in the bassinet, and the boy who had just altered his understanding of trust. Jonathan was used to making offers, to sealing deals with contracts and signatures, but this was different. He could sense Malik's hesitation, the way the boy's jaw tightened as if carrying invisible weights. For Jonathan, the offer was simple: a generous payment, luxurious accommodations, and the chance to keep close the person who had given him back his daughter's peace. But for Malik, it was not so simple. It was not just about money, it was about identity, about how he wanted to shape the story of his life. Jonathan broke the silence first, his tone gentler than the hard-edged authority he used in business. "You don't have to answer now. Take your time. Think about it. You've got enough on your plate with your tournament. I just want you to know the door is open." Malik nodded slowly, appreciating the lack of pressure, but still feeling the decision looming. "I can't just think about myself," Malik said finally. "Every move I make affects my family. My mom sacrificed everything for me to get here. My sister looks at me like I'm supposed to show her what's possible. If I take a detour, if I lose focus, it's not just me who pays the price." Jonathan studied him, realizing again how different their lives had been. He thought about his own childhood, his father pushing him toward business school, his mother arranging tutors and mentors to smooth every step. He had never carried the weight of anyone else's survival on his shoulders, yet this teenager did it with a steadiness that humbled him. "I respect that," Jonathan said after a moment. "But I also want you to know, opportunities don't always come when it's convenient. Sometimes the best moves are the ones you didn't plan for." Malik met his eyes, recognizing the truth in the words, but also feeling the tension of risk. He had learned in chess that not every tempting move was wise, that sometimes the path that looked most advantageous was a trap. Was this offer a gift or was it a distraction? He could not be sure. Around them, the cabin began to stir as attendants prepared for the landing in Paris. Trays clinked, announcements echoed, and the once hostile passengers now stole furtive glances at the boy who had calmed the baby and earned the gratitude of a billionaire. Malik noticed the shift. The subtle way their gazes had changed from suspicion to something closer to respect, though he knew how quickly that could vanish once the moment passed. Still, he sat a little taller, not because of their approval, but because he had reminded himself of his own worth. Jonathan reached into the bassinet to adjust Emma's blanket, his movements still clumsy, but more confident than they had been hours earlier. He glanced at Malik and said, "I want to be honest with you. When you first stepped forward, I doubted you. I judged you by how you looked, where you came from, and for that I owe you more than just thanks. I owe you respect." Malik absorbed the words quietly, not needing an apology, but appreciating the acknowledgement. "People doubt me all the time," he replied simply. "It's nothing new, but sometimes you prove them wrong, and sometimes they learn." Jonathan felt the sting of those words, not as an accusation, but as a truth he could not deny. He realized that this boy had not only helped his daughter, but had forced him to confront his own blind spots, the assumptions he carried without question. That realization felt like a gift wrapped in discomfort, the kind of lesson money could not buy. As the plane began its descent, Malik looked out the window at the faint outline of Paris emerging below, the city shimmering in the early light. He had never seen Europe before, never dreamed of staying in luxury hotels or being courted by billionaires. But now those possibilities pressed against him, demanding consideration. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket with a text from his mother. "Did you land safe? How's the flight?" Malik's chest tightened. He typed back quickly, "Still in the air, almost there. Something happened. I'll explain later." He hesitated, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. Some truths needed time. Jonathan, watching him, felt compelled to offer reassurance. "Whatever you decide, Malik, I want you to know this. What you did today mattered. You didn't just calm my daughter. You reminded me that strength doesn't always come from where people expect it. That's something I won't forget." Malik turned to him, his expression steady, and nodded. "And what you offered me, that's not something I'll forget either. I just need to figure out what the right move is." Jonathan smiled faintly, hearing the chess metaphor woven into the boy's words. "Fair enough," he said softly. "Just remember, sometimes the right move isn't the one that feels safest. Sometimes it's the one that changes the whole board." The plane touched down moments later, the wheels jarring against the runway, the cabin filling with the rustle of passengers gathering their belongings. The embossed business card was still in his pocket, the edges sharp against his leg, a constant reminder that one choice could split his life into two very different futures. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted into the usual restlessness of passengers eager to disembark. But for Malik, there was nothing routine about what came next. He was stepping into a city he had never seen, with decisions hanging over him that could reshape not only his own destiny, but his family's as well. Jonathan busied himself gathering Emma's things, the diaper bag and blankets scattered around him like debris after a storm. But every so often his eyes flicked to Malik, his expression thoughtful, as if still trying to reconcile the fact that the boy sitting beside him had shown him strength that none of his expensive experts had ever delivered. When the doors opened and the first-class passengers began filing out, Jonathan hesitated, shifting Emma in his arms as Catherine Whitmore appeared at the private terminal, her polished presence unmistakable even from a distance. She kissed her husband lightly on the cheek before immediately reaching for Emma, her movements efficient and confident, as though accustomed to handling crises without flinching. But her confidence faltered for a split second when Jonathan introduced Malik. Catherine's eyes scanned him quickly, taking in his hoodie, his worn jeans, his youth, and his skin. And though she masked it well, Malik had been judged enough in his life to recognize the flicker of doubt. He braced himself for dismissal, for polite words and a cool smile, but instead Catherine's gaze shifted to Emma, who nestled quietly against her chest without fussing. For the first time in countless flights, their daughter was calm, and Catherine's surprise softened her expression. "She managed the entire trip without another meltdown?" she asked incredulously, looking from Jonathan to Malik. Jonathan gave a short laugh, weary but genuine. "Not because of me. Malik has a gift." Catherine's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched, and she studied the boy again, this time with genuine curiosity. "Is that so?" Malik nodded respectfully, his voice steady despite the weight of her gaze. "I just did what I used to do for my sister when she was a baby. Sometimes you learn things because you have to." Catherine absorbed his words, and Malik saw her assessment shift, suspicion giving way to cautious respect. "Remarkable," she murmured, glancing down at her daughter. "The last time we flew, the pilot threatened to make an emergency landing." Jonathan chuckled ruefully, adjusting the strap of the diaper bag. "That's why I offered him a position with us during our stay in Paris. He hasn't decided yet, but I hope he will." Catherine looked back at Malik, and this time there was warmth in her smile, the kind of warmth that surprised him after so many cold appraisals from strangers. If he can keep Emma calm, then he's already worth his weight in gold. They moved toward the waiting car, the bustle of the airport fading as they entered the privacy of the terminal. But Malik's mind spun faster than the wheels beneath him. He had expected to land, catch the train to London, and focus entirely on the tournament. But now the Reeds had folded him into their world, even if only temporarily, and the ripple effect of that encounter on the plane was already spreading. Catherine's tone carried sincerity when she wished him luck in the competition, And though Malik had braced himself for condescension, he felt none. Instead, he sensed genuine curiosity, as though she too wanted to understand the boy who had turned a nightmare flight into a quiet miracle. Later, as Malik boarded the Eurostar bound for London, the weight of the day settled over him. The train hurtled through the French countryside, and in the reflection of the window, he saw both a chess player preparing for the most important tournament of his life and a young man holding a card that tied him to one of the most powerful families in America. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother, Gloria. "Did you land safely?" He typed back quickly, "Yes. Headed to London now. You won't believe what happened on the flight." But he stopped himself from explaining everything in detail. Some stories required the right moment, and this one was still unfolding. At the tournament hotel, Malik immersed himself in preparation, laying out his travel chess set, reviewing notes, and reminding himself that the scholarship remained his priority. Yet even as he studied openings and strategies, Jonathan's words replayed in his mind. Sometimes the right move isn't the one that feels safest. Sometimes it's the one that changes the whole board. Malik recognized the truth in those words because chess had taught him that forks and sacrifices define champions, that victory often required stepping into discomfort. But he also knew that in life, unlike chess, the stakes involved people he loved, people whose sacrifices had given him this chance. As the first day of the tournament unfolded, Malik proved himself again, defeating opponents from Russia and India with the patience and precision his coach had drilled into him. The murmurs of his skill spread across the hall, his name whispered alongside favorites who had the backing of sponsors and wealthy families. But even in victory, Malik felt the presence of the offer from Paris hovering over him, shaping his choices, reminding him that success could no longer be measured solely by trophies. When he checked his phone after his second win, a message from Jonathan was waiting. "How did the first day go?" Olivia slept soundly again. "Catherine thinks you're a magician. We're cheering for you from Paris." Malik smiled despite himself, feeling the unlikely thread that now connected his world to theirs. The final day of the tournament dawned gray and cool in London, the kind of day that made the city seem wrapped in history, and Malik Carter stood before the board with his hands steady though his heart raced. Across from him sat Zimmerman, the German champion whose precision and discipline had made him nearly unbeatable all season, and the hall was filled with spectators and reporters who had come to see which young prodigy would rise. Malik thought of his mother back in Chicago, of Zoe who would be watching updates on a borrowed phone, of his coach who had drilled him through late nights when exhaustion pressed like a weight. And he thought too of the plane ride, of Emma's cries, of Jonathan's humbled eyes, and of the offer that still pressed against his pocket like a living thing. The match began, the pieces sliding across the board with quiet inevitability, every move a test of patience and vision. For hours they played, Zimmerman pressing, Malik waiting, the tension in the hall building with every exchange until the moment came. Malik saw it, the subtle opening, the chance to sacrifice a knight in exchange for positioning that would collapse Zimmerman's defense. And though it was risky, though the crowd gasped when he made the move, Malik knew it was the right one. 5 moves later Zimmerman resigned, his hand heavy as it tipped over his king, and the hall erupted in applause. Malik sat back, the noise crashing over him like a wave, and for the first time allowed himself to breathe. He was the champion. The scholarship was his. The future he had worked for was within reach. Yet even in that moment of triumph, as he accepted the trophy and shook hands with opponents and officials, Malik felt the other weight in his pocket, the reminder that his story had already stretched beyond the chessboard. When the hall cleared and the reporters had taken their photos, he found Vivian, Jonathan's assistant, waiting with her immaculate poise, her phone in hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice crisp but warmer than he expected. "Mr. Whitmore would like to speak with you." She handed him the phone, and Jonathan's voice came through immediately, filled with pride. "Malik, I watched the stream. That sacrifice, it was brilliant. You saw what no one else did. Congratulations, champion." Malik felt the word resonate, not just as a title, but as recognition of everything he had fought for. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steady. Jonathan hesitated, then said, "The offer still stands. Come to Paris. Work with us for a week. After that, we'll talk about the foundation. But no pressure. Whatever you choose, I'll respect it." Malik closed his eyes, the noise of the tournament hall fading as he weighed the choice one last time. He thought of his mother's exhaustion, the lines etched deep into her face. He thought of Zoe, eager and hopeful, needing proof that their struggles meant something. And he thought of Emma, her small body trembling until he had steadied her, her cries subsiding because he had listened. The decision crystallized. "I'll come," Malik said quietly, "but not because I want charity. I'll come because I think there's something to learn from you, from your family, and maybe you can learn from me too." Jonathan's laugh came through the phone, rich and unguarded. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." The next day, Malik boarded the train to Paris, the trophy carefully packed in his bag, his heart torn between the familiar weight of duty and the strange new pull of opportunity. When he arrived at the Hotel George V, Catherine welcomed him with a handshake and a smile that carried none of the earlier doubt, and Emma reached for him with tiny hands as though she remembered him. For a week, Malik lived in a world so different from his own that at times it felt like stepping onto another planet. Lavish breakfasts, glittering ballrooms where Jonathan spoke with heads of industries, quiet evenings where he rocked Emma to sleep while teaching Jonathan the rhythm of firm but gentle pressure. Yet even in that world, Malik never forgot where he came from. He called his mother every night, telling her about the city, about the reeds, about the possibilities unfolding. She listened with pride and caution, reminding him that opportunities were tools, not lifelines, and that his value had always been his own. Malik carried those words with him as Jonathan and Catherine introduced him to the Reed Foundation, explaining how they wanted his input on a new initiative that would recognize and support skills often overlooked: emotional intelligence, caregiving, resilience born in places where privilege never reached. It humbled him to think that the techniques passed down from his mother could ripple outward to shape something larger, something that might help others like him. When the week ended and Malik prepared to return to Chicago, Jonathan and Catherine presented him with a gift: a chess set crafted from jade and rose quartz, inlaid on a board of mother of pearl. Inside the box was a card with handwritten words: "For the champion who reminded us that the most valuable moves are the ones that change the entire board. With gratitude, Jonathan, Catherine, and Emma." Malik held the set with reverence, knowing it was more than a token. It was acknowledgement, respect, and a bridge between worlds. At the airport, as he hugged Emma one last time and shook Jonathan's hand, he realized that he was leaving not as an employee, not even as a prodigy, but as a young man who had proven his worth in a way that transcended race and class. Jonathan looked at him with genuine respect, the kind of respect that could not be bought or forced, and said, "Safe travels, Malik. This is only the beginning. Stay in touch. Some connections are meant to last." Malik nodded, feeling the truth in the words. As his plane lifted off toward Chicago, Malik reflected on everything that had happened. The baby's cries that had forced him to rise from his seat, the suspicion he had faced, the respect he had earned, the victories on the chessboard, and the offer that had shifted his world. He realized that the most meaningful part of it all was not the trophy, not the luxury, not even the foundation's promise. It was the recognition of worth across boundaries that were never meant to divide in the first place. In chess, the most powerful move is often the quiet one, the move that changes the structure of the game and creates new possibilities. In life, Malik understood now the same was true. He had made such a move when he stepped forward on that flight, and the ripple effects had built a bridge between worlds that might never have touched. That bridge, fragile but real, was proof that humanity could rise above prejudice, that wisdom could come from unexpected places, and that respect could grow where suspicion once lived. As the clouds parted beneath him, Malik allowed himself a smile. The game of life was far from over, but he had already proven that one brave move could change the board forever. The end. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the way the story unfolded? And how do you feel about the ending? Share your perspective in the comments. and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your feedback helps shape the stories we tell next.